defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else.
April 1945 on the Oder River, a good 60 kilometers northeast of Berlin. In what was then Niederwutzen, a Wehrmacht infantry battalion was engaged in combat with units of the advancing Red Army. This footage was among the last scenes shot by German propaganda units in that war. Despite the Third Reich's hopeless military situation, shots of good-humored German soldiers and fallen Red Army soldiers was supposed to spread optimism. According to Nazi logic, surrender was not an option.
Hitler verordnet eine Art Pflicht zum Untergang.
Hitler decreed that it was a kind of duty to die, which many soldiers did. It was simply that they didn't want to suffer another 1918, that is, a defeat, because they surrendered too early. This time, the soldiers would rather surrender 5 minutes after 12 than 5 minutes before 12. All this, of course, with horrendous losses.
January 1945 was the month with the most casualties of the entire war, with 450,000 dead, and in the weeks that followed, the great dying continued. Despite the omnipresent danger of death, many German soldiers fought on doggedly, especially on the Eastern Front.
The idea of surrendering, from today's point of view, one would say that the war was lost after all. But that wasn't an option for the vast majority of soldiers on the Eastern Front. You only go into captivity when you look down the barrel of the tank and have no alternative. Otherwise, the measure is to avoid, if possible, captivity, which one imagines terrible.
By mid-April, the Red Army had reached almost every part of the western bank of the Oder. On the Seelow Heights, a natural elevation in the Oderbruch, German units entrenched themselves in order to achieve the impossible and to stop the advance on Berlin. In the early morning hours of April 16th, some 900,000 soldiers of the First White Russian Front, supported by heavy artillery fire, began the assault on the Seelow Heights. The German defense consisted of worn-out frontline fighters, Hitler Youth, and KVH soldiers, which the Wehrmacht administration translated as fit for war. In soldier jargon, can limp excellently. Numerically, the Soviet enemy outnumbered them at least 4-1. Nevertheless, they succeeded in stopping the Red Army for the time being. Russian Commanding General Georgy Zhukov became increasingly nervous.
The Soviet side was under enormous pressure. It was an unspoken goal to conquer Berlin by May Day. The Soviet leadership reacted accordingly and tried to break through the German front line by any means possible.
In their desperation, the commanders resorted to unconventional means so they could announce the demanded breakthrough. In doing so, they showed no consideration for their own soldiers.
One example was that the Soviet attackers tried to illuminate the battlefield with the help of searchlights. As a result, the German defenders saw the silhouettes very clearly and knew exactly what to shoot at.
The toll in blood on both sides was enormous. The Russians suffered more than 30,000 casualties, while the Germans lost at least 12,000 men. After 4 days, the road to Berlin was cleared. In the West, the situation for the German defenders continued to deteriorate. After crossing the Rhine, the Allies advanced inexorably eastward, conquering city after city.
The strength of the Wehrmacht had been exhausted in February 45, and by March of 45 they no longer had the strength to maintain an orderly defense. Everything was collapsing.
Like the Red Army in the East earlier, as they advanced, the forces of the Western powers were faced with the evidence of the crimes of the Nazi era, to which millions of people had fallen victim over the past years. In mid-April, British units reached the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp near Celle. For years, people were tortured, abused, and murdered there. The battle-hardy soldiers were used to death and suffering, but what they saw there dwarfed what they had experienced so far.
British soldiers have described that they thought they would be greeted with cheers and that they would arrive as liberators. Instead, what they saw in Bergen-Belsen was terrible, emaciated figures, corpses on the street. The survivors were not able to move at all. The cheers were quite limited because everyone was too weak to express human emotion.
By the end of the war, at least 75,000 prisoners were crammed there, including many women and children. The German Jewish girl Anne Frank, who later became famous, was also interned there and died in the camp. The British immediately set about feeding the survivors. They succeeded in arresting Josef Kramer, the camp commander. To their surprise, the ardent Nazi showed no remorse.
The camp commander still acted as if he was the boss, because he assumed that the conquerors who arrived there also considered the people lying there on piles of corpses to be subhumans, that they would consider that normal. In the separate room he was in at some point, when the job of murder became routine, he felt that he was doing a job that was not morally wrong in the Nazi regime, because after all, they were the enemies of society, and he was putting things in life in order.
A few days earlier, U.S. troops had liberated several concentration camps. In Thuringia, they had taken control of Buchenwald and the Ohrdruf satellite camp. For many GIs, what they saw in the camps changed their attitude toward the enemy. Most of my comrades had no personal reason to fight the Germans, one soldier later recalled. They thought that many of the stories they had read or heard in newspapers were made up, or at least exaggerated. Now, the soldiers were proved wrong. After the liberation of the camps, the Allies forced the population of neighboring towns to visit the complexes and see for themselves the horror. For many Germans, that was a shocking experience.
The idea was, when they were fully confronted with the crimes, it would start their cognitive process, which should lead to the purification of the German civilian population. It is well known that this didn't work immediately. Some people reacted rather defensively to this. But one can at least theorize whether it was a beginning, so that parts of the civilian population came to terms with the crimes in the first place, and that at least hopefully then did lead to a reorientation.
On the 19th of April, U.S. units reached Leipzig. Joseph Goebbels appealed to the German population on that Thursday. Bravely take on a fight that is inevitable and unavoidable, to stand upright before one's fate with a clear conscience and a pure heart, to endure all suffering and every trial, but never even think of wavering in the agonizing hour of the final decision and throwing in the towel. That is not only manly, it is also German in the best sense of the word. Pathetic words that were unable to stop the advance of the GIs. In Leipzig, the main train station was quickly taken. There was only isolated resistance. Resistance groups had been distributing leaflets for days with slogans such as "End the insane war of the Nazis" and "Bring out the white flags." Many Leipzigers had obviously taken the messages to heart and hoped for a bloodless end to the war.
They kind of just wanted to get through it. They waited for the Americans. That's when you had the most hope. And somewhere, at some point, this madness would end. At least, that was the dominant feeling among the people who no longer believed in National Socialism.
But as in all parts of the Reich, there were also fanatical supporters of the regime in Saxony. At City Hall, the Americans made a gruesome discovery. The mayor had committed suicide along with his wife and daughter. The city treasurer also followed them to their deaths.
This situation was accompanied by an unprecedented wave of suicides. So for many people it really was the downfall, and they couldn't imagine a world beyond the NS. But they could imagine a world beyond these conditions. That was, of course, the unique mood of doom that prevailed at that time.
50 kilometers northeast of Leipzig lies Torgau. The small town on the Elbe became world famous shortly before the end of the war. On April 26, 1945, soldiers from the Red Army and the U.S. Army celebrated their meeting there. In fact, their units had met for the first time the day before. 3.5 years of a brotherhood in arms against the Nazis lay behind them. The new U.S. President Harry S. Truman spoke from Washington. The joining of our armed forces at this moment is a signal to ourselves and to the world that our nations working together in the cause of peace and freedom is an effective cooperation. But reality was different. It was a friendship whose end would not be long in coming. While propaganda images were still being taken on the shore, people were fleeing in boats across the Elbe to the west. They wanted to flee the Soviet sphere of influence. It was a step that many soldiers also took during those weeks, as here in Tungermünde, soldiers were desperately trying to get across the Elbe. Their motive was clear.
For German soldiers, it was clear. In Allied captivity, you were likely to be treated somewhat in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. And so it was much easier for a German soldier to raise his hands on the Western Front than on the Eastern Front.
Having arrived in the territory that was barely under Western Allied control, many of the infantrymen surrendered. During that time, U.S. troop cameramen documented on almost a daily basis with color film how more and more members of the Wehrmacht were putting their hands in the air instead of on a gun. This was not without danger. The commander-in-chief of the German Army Group South issued an unequivocal order at the end of March. Anyone who strays from the troops in combat must report immediately to the nearest fighting troop. Finding them is not difficult. The noise of battle is the surest guide. Anyone who disobeyed the order ran the risk of being sentenced to death for desertion. But more and more soldiers were willing to take that risk.
The Americans took millions of prisoners of war. The Wehrmacht was crumbling as they crossed the Rhine. And now the question was what to do with them.
The men were initially locked up in fenced-in, open-air meadows and fields. Then the idea came up to group them together in huge camps. Thousands of infantrymen were loaded onto military trucks and taken to the Rhineland. In April, huge open spaces along the river were fenced in with barbed wire. The so-called Rhine Meadow camps were built. To make it difficult for the prisoners to escape, the complexes were built on the west bank of the river. They were officially called prisoner of war temporary enclosures. The sanitary conditions and the food supply in the camps were catastrophic from the very start.
Now the policy was that the Germans should feel that they had lost the war. They should understand what they had done. There had to be punishment. That's what the soldiers had to endure there, because they were badly fed. Thousands died. And you have to say quite clearly, they died senselessly, because the Americans could take better care of them. But they accepted the fact that a few thousand would die there.
While hundreds of thousands of soldiers in captivity in the West awaited the end of the war, people in Berlin faced the prospect of a final battle proclaimed by the regime. For weeks that spring, the Berliners had been setting up 1,945 barricades and roadblocks and armed themselves as best they could for the impending attack by the Red Army, an endeavor that was as helpless as it was hopeless. On the 1st of February, the city was declared a fortress.
The battle for Berlin was the last act of the war. At that time, in 1939, Berlin was a city that had over 4 million inhabitants. At the end, there were about 2.5 million left, and this very densely populated area now became a battlefield.
On April 21st, the first Soviet units crossed the Berlin Ring Road. As heavy artillery fire began and the Soviet Air Force attacked and Red Army troops advanced into the outlying districts, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels addressed the city's population by radio.
Verteidiger Berlins, auf euch sind die Blicke eurer Frauen, eurer Mütter und eurer Kinder gerichtet. Sie haben euch ihr Leben, ihr Glück, ihre Gesundheit und ihre Zukunft anvertraut. Ihr kennt jetzt eure Aufgabe und ich weiß, ihr werdet sie vorbildlich erfüllen. An den Mauern unserer Stadt wird und muss der Mongolensturm gebrochen werden. Unser Kampf wird das Banal sein für den entschlossensten Kampf der ganzen Nation. Von dem fanatischen Willen erfüllt, die Hauptstadt des Reiches nicht in die Hände der Bolschewisten fallen zu lassen, sind wir solidarisch zu Kampf und Arbeit angetreten.
A last loyal contingent of the regime was forming up in the ruins to defend Berlin and the Führer. The dictator had decided to stay in the city.
Before these battles began, they had considered flying Hitler out to Berchtesgaden. But he deliberately chose a really big stage, a stage on which he could act as a statesman and a general.
The Red Army soldiers fought their way inexorably through the outskirts toward the government district. There was heavy fighting in the ruined landscape, which was documented by Russian cameramen. 30,000 meters of propaganda footage were created during those bloody battles. The Soviet commanders showed no consideration, neither for German civilians nor for their own soldiers.
Berlin could have been surrounded. Instead, they took it house by house. And 10,000 Red Army soldiers died in that senseless fighting. And the way the Soviet Union waged war, well, that surprised even the Allies.
On the German side, too, the price that had to be paid was enormous. Exactly how many people lost their lives in Hitler's capital is unknown. At noon on April 25th, the Red Army closed the ring around Berlin. Their tanks advanced toward the center of the city. Hitler remained in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery, refusing to acknowledge defeat. For the last time, the Führer let himself be seen in the ruins of his official residence. It is not known exactly when this photo was taken.
Hitler then asked how long they could hold out, and the commander said only 24 hours. No longer, and only then, you can imagine, only then, after some delay, did Hitler decide to commit suicide. He really tried to continue the fighting until the last conceivable moment.
Hitler dictated his political legacy, then he married his longtime lover Eva Braun. In the early afternoon of April 30th, they both retired to their private rooms in the bunker. These are photos of the rooms taken weeks later. The dictator shot himself in the head with a bullet. His wife died by poison. Both bodies were then doused with gasoline in the garden of the Reich Chancellery and burned.
Hitler always repeated, "I will not stop until 5 minutes past 12. That was basically brutal, inhuman, but also a simple strategy which he implemented to the end.
Even after the death of the Führer, the fighting continued. On the 1st of May, the Red Army had taken parts of the government district and stood within sight of the Brandenburg Gate and the Reich Chancellery. Joseph Goebbels was now in command here. Hitler had decreed that Grand Admiral Dönitz would become Reich President and Propaganda Minister Goebbels Reich Chancellor. The latter tried to start negotiating surrender terms with the Red Army, but the Soviets, on Stalin's orders, insisted on the immediate and unconditional surrender of the city. On the 1st of May 1945, the majority of Berliners recognized the reality on the ground and hung white flags from their windows. In the evening, the Greater German radio reported a lie.
Aus dem Führerhauptquartier wird gemeldet, dass unser Führer Adolf Hitler heute Nachmittag in seinem Befehlsstand in der Reichskanzlei bis zum letzten Atemzuge gegen den Bolschewismus kämpfend für Deutschland gefallen ist.
In the next few hours, Joseph Goebbels also took his life. His wife died with him. Earlier, they had poisoned their children. In the mind of the fanatical Nazi Goebbels, that was inevitable.
Goebbels wrote in his diary that when a fortress commander surrendered, he didn't even have the courage to kill himself. He was consistent, and it was also consistent to kill his children, because after a Soviet occupation, life would no longer be possible, and they shouldn't have to endure that. A life in a post-Nazi era.
The charred remains of the Goebbels and the bodies of their 6 children were lined up by Red Army soldiers in the garden of the Reich Chancellery a short time later. In the meantime, Berlin had surrendered unconditionally. The Soviets took command of the city on the 2nd of May, 1945. But there was still no peace. A woman in Berlin described the apocalyptic scenes in her diary. Panic reigns in the city, dismay and horror. Wherever we go, robbery, looting, violence. In unrestrained lust, the army of our victors has pounced on the women of Berlin. They ravish our daughters, they rape our women, the men complained. Not once, no, 6 times, no, 10 times and 20 times. There is no other conversation in the city. Even after the fall of the German capital, the war was still not over. The new government under Reich President Dönitz tried to delay the impending surrender. Their logic? To buy time so that as many German soldiers as possible could reach the areas controlled by the British and Americans and thus escape the dreaded Soviets. Here, as in Saxony, long lines of soldiers formed in many places. All were headed west. The commander-in-chief of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, U.S. General Eisenhower, had been based in Reims, France, since September 1944. On the 6th of May, a German delegation under Colonel General Alfred Jodl went to the city. In a middle school in Rue Jolicoeur, a decision was made to end the war. Completely misjudging the situation, the German negotiators still believed they had room to negotiate.
There was still this idea, we'll negotiate. We'll surrender only in the West. But then it was total surrender.
After all German attempts had failed, Jodl radioed Reich President Dönitz at 9:45 in the evening. "I see no other way out than chaos or signing." A few hours later, he received a reply. Authority to sign granted. At 2:41 on the morning of May 7th, Jodl signed the document.
In a little schoolhouse in Reims, France, came the unconditional surrender of Germany. General Alfred Jodl, Nazi Chief of Staff, signed the document formally ending all German resistance, as drawn by the representatives of Russia, Britain, France, and the United States. General Walter Bedell Smith signed for the Supreme Command, and the end of one of history's most massive and most brilliant campaigns brought a moment of well-earned joy to an American soldier named Ike Eisenhower.
As in London, joy erupted across much of Europe when the news from Reims was announced. After more than 5.5 years, peace would return to the continent. But not everyone was celebrating exuberantly. On the Soviet side, mistrust mingled with the joy of victory.
Reims unsettled the Soviets because there was a great fear on both sides that, so to speak, one side could make a separate peace with the other side and then somehow still continue the war, or something like that. And the Soviet Union then insisted that this surrender ceremony will be repeated again.
The procedure was repeated on May 8th in a former Wehrmacht pioneer and engineering school in the Berlin-Karlshorst district. That way, Soviet fears were to be allayed and the contribution made by the Red Army in the liberation of Europe could be properly recognized. General Georgy Zhukov took part in the ceremony on behalf of the Soviets. In addition to the British and Americans, French representatives were now part of the delegation of the victorious powers. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, arrived to represent Germany. The surrender was signed on the night of the 8th of May. It read, "We the undersigned, acting by proxy for and on behalf of the Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces, hereby declare the unconditional surrender of all land, sea, and air forces under German command or control at the present time simultaneously to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces and the Supreme Command of the Red Army."
At that moment, which was the process of several days, when the Germans capitulated, everything that the German Empire had to offer in terms of power was used up. Stunde Null, 0 hour, is a very old-fashioned term, but it describes it. There is nothing of substance left of the military and politics.
A few days after the formal end of the war, one of the best-known leaders of the Third Reich fell into the hands of the Allies. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had long been second in command. In the last days of the war, however, he fell from grace and was deposed by Hitler. After the collapse of the regime, he now saw himself once again in a state-supporting role and was surprised to find that, like any ordinary soldier, he was first disarmed and then imprisoned.
The moment he was captured by the Americans, he adopted a different role and claimed that he had been the foreign policy officer who tried to prevent what happened. He claimed to be the moderating factor. He said that the Allies now needed him as a prominent man of the state to now lead the German population into a new era. Stuff like that. Wrong, confused assumptions.
In 1935, Goering had promulgated the Nuremberg Laws, which sealed the disenfranchisement of Jewish citizens. Later, he signed the order for the so-called final solution of the Jewish question, and thus played a part in the Holocaust. A few months in the fall of 1946, after these films were made, Goering, along with other Nazi criminals, were indicted by the Allies and sentenced to death in Nuremberg. However, the sentence could not be carried out.
He had hidden 2 poison capsules in his luggage and had written a farewell letter. In it he wrote, "The German Reichsmarschall will not let himself be executed by hanging. So I choose the death of the great Hannibal." And then shortly before the execution, he poisoned himself.
The British were also searching for German war criminals. On the 20th of May, they noticed a man who called himself Heinrich Hitzinger and claimed to be a member of the secret field police. The policeman looked suspicious and was arrested. During his interrogation in Lüneburg, he was caught up in contradictions. They also noticed that he resembled the most wanted Nazi mass murderer. Heinrich Himmler was caught. When they went to search him, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. After Hitler and Goebbels, the former Reichsführer SS thus also cowardly evaded responsibility for his murderous actions. Wednesday, the 23rd of May, 1945, also marked the end of Grand Admiral Dönitz's insane attempt to rule Germany from Flensburg. Dönitz had been appointed Reich President by Hitler, but in fact remained completely powerless. Together with other men of his cabinet, he was arrested. Thus, only 3 weeks after the suicide of its leader, the Third Reich was history. On June 24, 1945, victory over Nazi Germany was celebrated in Moscow with a huge military parade in Red Square.
Москва, Красная площадь. Здесь, у стен Седого Кремля, встречала страна своих сыновей, вернувшихся с победой, героев беспримерных сражений на всех фронтах Отечественной войны, от Баренцева до Черного моря. Вот те, кто форсировал Днепр и Одер, Кёнигсберга, Вены, и кто водрузил знамя нашей победы над Берлином.
For the Soviet side, of course, it was existential, especially after what they went through. There were about 26.6 million victims. That's the official figure, both civilians and soldiers. And that moment of victory was, of course, quite central to the Stalinist regime.
With Stalin watching, 10,000 soldiers from all branches of the armed forces marched past Lenin's mausoleum. General Zhukov, who had led the offensive against Berlin, played a central role.
Zhukov was the one who embodied this big heavy man on a strong white horse that embodied victory for the people. The downside for Zhukov was that his military career, as well as his political influence in general, was of course over, because Stalin as generalissimo was of course considered the actual architect of this victory, and that legend should not be changed.
Stalin was at the height of his power. With the victory over Hitler's Reich, Eastern Europe had fallen into the hands of the Soviet leader. From then on, Stalin's soldiers were his most loyal supporters. With their help, he could consolidate the Soviet Union's status as a superpower and stand up to the United States in a new conflict that was slowly brewing, the Cold War. A time when hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were sent to their death seemed to be forgotten. In Berlin, the picture was different. The city lay in ruins. More than 28 square kilometers of the city had been destroyed over the years by air raids and the defensive battle against the Red Army. The city center had been hit particularly hard. The magnificent boulevard Unter den Linden, where 12 years earlier Nazis had celebrated Hitler's seizure of power and paraded through the Brandenburg Gate with torches, lay in ruins. Some Berliners lived in apartments without exterior walls called birds' nests. But almost immediately after the Soviets moved in, people set about rebuilding. Cleanup crews were on the move everywhere. Their pay for the hard work, 72 pfennigs an hour. The four victorious powers officially assumed supreme government power in Germany. It was exercised by the Allied Control Council, which was made up of representatives of Great Britain, France, the US, and the Soviet Union. At the beginning of July, the agreed-upon division of Berlin into sectors was implemented. The three Western Allies moved into their areas in the city. U.S. troops were accompanied by cameramen of the Special Film Project 186 unit. Their job was to document the bomb damage on the German side. More and more frequently, however, they also filmed people. Like these children in Berlin who, presumably in search of relatives, spoke directly into the camera. The sound on the film of these scenes did not survive, nor is there any information about whether their search was successful. In the middle of the month, the new U.S. President Harry S. Truman landed in the city. Seeing the condition of Berlin made the Democratic politician pensive. He noted, "I witnessed a great world tragedy, and I was grateful from the bottom of my heart that my country had been spared this unimaginable destruction." Truman had traveled to Germany to consult with the Soviets and the British about how to proceed in the future. The venue for the summit meeting was Sicilienhof Palace in Potsdam. It was the home of the German Crown Prince and his family before 1918. Starting on July 17th, representatives of the three main allies met in the palace. It was an effort to publicly demonstrate unity after their triumph over the enemy. In addition to U.S. President Harry Truman, Stalin was also there. The British side was initially represented by Winston Churchill, who was replaced during the course of the conference after an electoral defeat.
In Potsdam ist der Wunsch da, wir haben gewonnen.
The aim in Potsdam was, we have won, and we are now collectively responsible for moving this continent securely into the future. But as we all know, war and violence continue.
An end to the common ground of the anti-Hitler coalition was not long in coming. Just before the conference began, President Truman received news that after a long effort, a new weapon with highly destructive and threatening potential was at his disposal.
Die USA hatten über einen sehr langen Zeitraum.
The US had been working on an atomic bomb for a long time. The tests had progressed to a point that the bombs could then be used. It was also apparent to the United States that sooner or later, for ideological reasons, the Soviet Union would become an adversary, and they wanted to demonstrate that the US was technically able and ready to use atomic bombs.
In the coming weeks, intensive negotiations took place at Sicilienhof Palace. The Big Three agreed on the amount of reparations Germany had to pay and on the denazification, democratization, and demilitarization of the country. Geographical changes were also determined. East Prussia and the areas east of the Oder and Neisse rivers, for example, were separated from Germany.
What they also decided in Potsdam was the resettlement of the German-speaking population of Eastern Europe. That is, the so-called contractual definition of resettlement. All remaining Germans were to be removed from Eastern Europe.
In the run-up to the summit, German-speaking people had been expelled from Eastern Europe. Those expulsions took place mostly in the Sudetenland, which had been annexed by the German Reich in 1938, but also in Poland, and often it was done with great brutality.
The Czech government in exile under Beneš said they would not be punished, but that such an expulsion was a logical consequence because of the previously German-forced rule. And German property could be taken away from them without any further ado.
After the agreement in Potsdam, a regulated phase of expulsions followed in late summer. Once again, large streams of refugees set out for the West. But those people were not always welcome in their new homeland.
After the war, Germany had to deal with a multitude of problems. There were many who had been bombed out, poverty, worries about the future, so that an influx of a large number of people was not exactly celebrated. In fact, many were greeted with blatant rejection. They were also perceived as foreign, had a different dialect, looked different. In addition, there was interconfessional mixing. Catholics came to Protestant areas, and Protestants went to Catholic areas, which was problematic at the time.
In total, at least 12 million people of Germanic origin were affected by flight, expulsion, and forced emigration. Despite the challenges, many managed to quickly settle into their new homeland.
It was a very, very great achievement that these people were accommodated in the occupation zones. But there was also a concerted effort on the part of the people who came to build a new life under difficult conditions. And it was amazing that people managed to get a foothold there in a relatively short time.
While the guns were silent in Europe after more than 5.5 years, World War II was not yet over in the Pacific. The Japanese Empire was fanatically resisting the threat of defeat. The battles for Okinawa had been raging since the beginning of April. The island's defenders had entrenched themselves in the hinterland and often fought to the death against the attacking U.S. units. It was only after nearly 3 months of fighting that the island was finally conquered at the end of June 1945. After a dearly bought victory, the U.S. military leadership began to consider its further action against the enemy.
Die Schlacht von Okinawa und auch die weiteren
The Battle of Okinawa, as well as other battles in 1945, had shown the United States that it would probably be unrealistic to conduct a landing operation on the Japanese mother islands. And that then led to the decision to use atomic bombs. The logic being, it's better if the Japanese die rather than if American soldiers die.
Amerikanische Soldaten ums Leben kommen.
The plan was quickly put into action. After Japan refused a U.S. ultimatum for unconditional surrender in late July, U.S. B-29 bombers were loaded with a new type of weapon of mass destruction on the Pacific island of Tinian in early August. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki was the target of another atomic bomb. At least 100,000 people were killed instantly in the attacks. Tens of thousands of others were irradiated, pushing the death toll higher in the years to come.
But it also became clear that protecting the Japanese, protecting Japanese life, of course, was not how people were thinking. The question, should we do this? That had been lost during the course of the war.
Footage shot weeks later in Hiroshima. At 8:16, the bomb had been detonated at an altitude of about 600 meters, obliterating the city. The pictures showed the devastating extent of the destructive power of the new weapon and heralded a new age. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people over the radio. It was the first time the Japanese had heard the voice of the emperor.
金が陸海将兵の優先、金が百両融資の冷静、金が1億収書の方向、各々最善を尽くせるに変わらず、戦局必ずしも好転せず、世界の体制また我にであらず、しかのみならず敵は新たに残虐なる爆弾を使用して地形に向こう殺傷し、
On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, the battleship USS Missouri was anchored in Tokyo Bay. Also aboard the flagship of the U.S. Third Fleet was Commander George Costco. He had a small camera loaded with color film with him, and so he shot this footage of the formal signing of Japan's surrender.
Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, on Sunday, September the 2nd, 1945, the most horrible war in history came to its complete and formal end. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu signed for Japan. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander. General Su Yung-chang signed for China. In New York City, as throughout a rejoicing nation and world, vast throngs of grateful, happy people celebrate the end of fighting, the dawn of peace. 2 million New Yorkers jammed Times Square. It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
The balance sheet of the Second World War was staggering. The number of its victims can only be estimated, but there were at least 60 million war dead, a number that cannot begin to describe the unimaginable suffering that began with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland. The costliest war in the history of mankind lasted 6 years and 1 day, 2,193 days of suffering and death.